Hey guys! Tonight we're easing into one of those sprawling old tales that manages to be both absurdly dramatic and weirdly boring if you look at it closely. Picture yourself beneath a heavy velvet sky, a bonfire flickering, shadows of armored figures cast across the sand. You can almost smell the tang of salt from the Aegean Sea, the iron of spears, and the faint sweetness of crushed olives someone forgot to pack properly. That's where you are, perched right at the beginning of the Trojan War. And spoiler, you probably won't survive this one, it lasts so long. Even the storytellers can't keep track. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's listening in. From now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all starts at a wedding, which sounds peaceful enough. King Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis are tying the knot, and every important deity is invited. That's a dangerous guest list: Zeus, Hera, Athena. Poseidon, basically a buffet of egos stacked around a golden banquet table. Only one goddess is left off the invitation, Eris, goddess of strife. And if you've ever thrown a party and excluded the one person who lives to stir drama, you can already guess what happens. She crashes it. Eris doesn't shout. She doesn't flip tables, no. She drops something shinier, a golden apple. Etched on its side are the words, "For the fairest." Immediately, three goddesses lock eyes across the table. Hera, queen of gods, Athena, warrior goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Each insists it must be hers. You can almost imagine the awkward silence, the clinking of goblets stopping, and Apollo in the corner whispering, "This is going to be bad." The problem is that beauty contests among immortals don't end with tiaras and roses. They end with wars. Zeus, smart enough to avoid being referee in this divine pageant, delegates the job. And like any bad manager, he doesn't choose another god, he picks a mortal. Enter Paris, a Trojan prince with a reputation for good looks and questionable judgment. Historians still argue whether Paris was chosen because of his fairness, or because he was expendable. Either way, it's not a gig you'd want. Meanwhile, the apple itself has a curious echo in history. Archaeologists remind us that offerings of fruit, particularly golden or gilded ones, were common in Greek ritual. Apples symbolized desire, fertility, sometimes discord. A quirky tidbit? Later writers said Eris didn't even need an apple, she just whispered rumors and watched humans implode. The apple was a shiny shortcut. Picture Paris tending sheep on Mount Ida, suddenly facing three radiant goddesses who've descended like influencers demanding likes. Each bribes him. Hera promises power and kingship, Athena offers victory and wisdom, and Aphrodite whispers the prize that seals fate: Helen, the most beautiful mortal woman alive. It's the kind of choice you'd want to phone a friend about, but no such lifeline exists. Paris makes his choice. He hands the apple to Aphrodite. Simple, right? Wrong. By doing so, he insults two of the most prideful deities on Olympus. Hera and Athena now burn with resentment, and Paris earns himself their eternal sabotage. Scholars still argue whether Homer's listeners saw this as divine comedy or tragic inevitability. But either way, the dominoes are falling. And here's where your sleepy brain gets a treat. This wasn't just myth, it reflected how Greeks explained long conflicts. Real wars often stretched for decades over trade routes, pride, and honor. The apple becomes shorthand for all the messy, petty reasons humans actually fight. A silly beauty contest somehow captures the grinding reality of why wars last forever. As you sink deeper into the cushions, imagine that apple rolling across a marble floor, chased by three glittering goddesses, and know that from that one absurd moment, an entire city's fate was sealed. You're still drifting in the glow of that golden apple. And now we follow it to the man forced to decide. Paris, the Trojan prince, is minding his sheep on Mount Ida, enjoying what is basically the Bronze Age version of a quiet pastoral retreat. The grass is rough underfoot, cicadas buzz like faulty speakers, and you can almost feel the heat of Anatolian sun pressing down. He probably expected a day of boredom, maybe tossing stones at goats. Instead, bound 3 goddesses descend from the sky, trailing shimmering robes and an air of celestial impatience. Paris doesn't stand a chance. He's mortal, soft around the edges compared to these glowing immortals. And yet the decision falls to him. Who is the fairest? It's not a beauty pageant, it's a cosmic trap. Hera steps forward first, regal in her crown, smelling faintly of incense and lightning storms. She leans in close and murmurs, "Choose me, and I'll give you power. Kingdoms, influence, every throne at your feet." It's the political bribe, neatly packaged. Athena takes her turn. She carries the crisp aura of a battlefield, spear gleaming. "Choose me," she says, "and I'll grant you unmatched wisdom and victory in war. No army could ever defeat you." It's the strategist's dream, the guarantee of success in the cutthroat world of Bronze Age kings. Then Aphrodite drifts forward, her smile just sharp enough to feel dangerous. "Choose me," she says, "and I'll give you the love of the most beautiful woman alive." And that woman is Helen, who inconveniently already has a husband. You can practically hear Paris' heartbeat in your ears, the decision weighing heavier than his shepherd's crook. Historians still argue whether this story was meant as moral lesson or comic parody. On one hand, it shows the dangers of choosing lust over wisdom or power. On the other, it might have been Homer winking at his audience. Can you believe a decade-long war started over this quirky detail? Some versions say Paris was actually a judge in local athletic contests before this. So maybe the gods figured, he's used to handing out trophies. The poor guy picks Aphrodite. Of course he does. The promise of irresistible love is too strong, even if it comes wrapped in disaster. By handing her the apple, Paris effectively declares war onto other goddesses without realizing it. Hera seethes, Athena smolders, and somewhere in the background Zeus probably chuckles, relieved it's not his problem anymore. This little judgment scene has ripples you can feel centuries later. Beauty contests, both literal and metaphorical, show up throughout history. Even the first recorded beauty prize in a festival at Lesbos might echo this myth. And modern scholars still debate, was Paris doomed because of his choice, or because the gods wanted a pretext to thin out the overpopulated world of men? You imagine Paris standing there after the goddesses vanish, apple gone, promises echoing, sheep bleating at his feet. He doesn't realize yet that Troy, his family, and even his own heart are already locked in a story no one can walk away from. And you, heavy-lidded, can feel how something so small, a fruit, a whisper, a choice, can stretch into a war that never seems to end. Paris, having tucked Aphrodite's promise into his heart like a reckless IOU, soon discovers what it really means. The goddess doesn't leave him guessing. She directs him straight toward Helen, the woman whose beauty had already become the kind of legend sung in smoky halls. You picture her in Sparta, her laughter echoing down marble corridors, a queen with sunlight caught in her hair. Helen isn't exactly available, though. She's married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and that fact alone should have been a gigantic red flag. But when gods back your romantic pursuits, red flags turn into confetti. Paris makes the fateful journey. Some accounts say he sails across the wine-dark sea with a merchant's excuse, bringing fine goods as if he were just another trading partner. Others suggest he comes under the guise of diplomacy, because let's face it, nobody suspects a guest at the feast will steal the host's wife. Historians still argue whether Helen went willingly or whether Aphrodite's magic compelled her. Some poets frame it as elopement, others as abduction. And in a culture where hospitality rules were sacred, this difference mattered. But the effect is the same. Paris and Helen leave Sparta. Picture the harbor at dawn, sails billowing, the salty wind tangling Helen's hair as the coastline shrinks behind them. In myth, Aphrodite ensures the crossing is smooth, though you know Menelaus' heart is about to break when he returns home to find his bed empty. Here's a quirky tidbit for your sleepy brain. There were versions where Helen never even went to Troy. Some storytellers, uncomfortable with the idea that Greece went to war over one woman, claimed she was spirited away to Egypt instead, and that the Greeks and Trojans fought over a phantom copy crafted by the gods. It's like the Bronze Age version of it was all a dream. Back in Troy, Paris presents his prize, Imagine the court's mixed reactions, his father Priam, the weary king, trying to hide dismay. Hector, Paris' heroic brother, probably groaning, "You brought home what?" And the Trojan people, already sensing this won't end well. Aphrodite beams with victory. But Hera and Athena seethe louder than the surf crashing against Troy's walls. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Menelaus fumes. The insult isn't just personal, it's cosmic. Hospitality has been shattered, trust violated. In Greek culture, this is worse than theft. It's sacrilege. And with Helen gone, the gears of vengeance begin to grind. Menelaus isn't just any wronged husband. He has powerful allies, and soon the entire Greek world will feel bound to act. The choice Paris made with that golden apple is no longer theoretical. It has flesh, blood, and the beginnings of a war story that refuses to end. You can almost hear the first war drums in the distance, faint beneath the lull of the sea, as you drift further into the inevitability of it all. So, here's where the whole messy situation gets even stickier. Remember Helen? Before she married Menelaus, she had been the most eligible bachelorette in Greece. Every important hero wanted her: Odysseus, Ajax, Menelaus, even kings from far-flung regions. It wasn't just about beauty, though the poets keep reminding you of her golden hair and dazzling presence. It was about politics. Marrying Helen meant inheriting connections, trade rights, and prestige. She was basically the ultimate prize in a world where alliances were everything. But there was a problem. Too many suitors. Imagine dozens of armored egos gathered in Sparta, each one ready to fight to the death over her hand. Tyndareus, Helen's mortal father, was terrified. If he chose one, the others might revolt. So he called in Odysseus, who even then had a reputation for clever solutions. Odysseus didn't really want Helen, he had his eyes on Penelope, the quieter but more dependable option. Still, he offered a trick to get what he wanted: make all the suitors swear an oath, and thus the famous oath of Tyndareus was born. Every suitor, whether they won Helen or not, had to swear a solemn vow to defend the chosen husband against any insult or attack related to her. Basically, they all signed up to be part of a lifelong mutual defense pact, just to avoid killing each other in the courtyard. Historians still argue whether such an oath reflects actual Greek practices. Some think it mirrors real alliances, sworn among chieftains, while others see it as pure poetic invention to explain why so many kings joined the war. Here's the quirky tidbit: apparently, to sweeten the deal for Odysseus, Tyndareus helped him secure Penelope's hand in marriage. So Odysseus got what he wanted, everyone else swore an oath, and Menelaus eventually won Helen. Crisis averted, at least until Paris strolled in years later and carried her off. Now picture Menelaus storming into his brother Agamemnon's hall after discovering the betrayal. His voice is hoarse, his face red, spittle flying as he recounts how a Trojan guest dared to steal his wife. He reminds Agamemnon of the oath, of the solemn vow sworn before the gods. The pact becomes binding, and like dominoes tipping one by one, the other kings must honor it. Some, like Nestor, are eager old warriors itching for relevance. Others, like Odysseus, pretend to be insane, yoking an ox and donkey to a plough until messengers catch him out. Even Achilles, still a youth in disguise on Ceros, is dragged into the commitment because prophecy insists the Greeks need him. This oath is the glue that holds the whole unwieldy coalition together. Without it, Menelaus might have been just another wronged husband. With it, he has the armies of Greece at his back, and with every hero reluctantly packing armor and sails, you sense the first true inevitability of war as you drift. Imagine the solemn scene, torches flickering, a line of men swearing before the gods, each one clasping hands and nodding grimly. None of them could have known that a careless apple and a rash promise would bind them to a decade of misery on foreign shores. And yet, here they are, marching straight into destiny, with you walking drowsily beside them. The oaths are sworn, the tempers are hot, and now the Greek kings begin the laborious task of gathering ships. You can almost hear the clamor of shipyards echoing across the Aegean axis, striking timber. Saws rasping, ropes creaking as masts are hoisted. The air smells of pine resin and salt, sweat and anticipation. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and older brother of Menelaus, steps into the role of commander-in-chief. Not because everyone loves him, far from it, but because he controls the largest fleet and wields enough arrogance to act like it's his birthright. Picture the harbors filling with black proud ships, each one painted and carved with some protective symbol, eyes to ward off evil, dolphins for luck, or lions to intimidate enemies. Warriors file aboard with bronze helmets that gleam in the sunlight, their shields painted with family crests, boars, serpents, spirals. It's a floating mosaic of Greek pride. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale Bronze Age fleets in the Mediterranean, where trading and raiding often blurred together. The Mycenaean Greeks really did have the capacity to assemble war fleets, though whether one as massive as Homer describes ever sailed is still debated. Now for the quirky tidbit, later storytellers inflated the numbers absurdly. Some claimed the Greek fleet had over 1,000 ships. To put that in perspective, it would have made Agamemnon the Elon Musk of naval logistics. But in sandals, more sober historians suggest maybe a few dozen, which still would have looked impressive on the horizon. And of course, not everyone is thrilled to join. Odysseus, always clever, fakes madness by ploughing a field with mismatched animals and sowing salt instead of seed. But when Palamedes tosses his infant son, Telemachus, in front of the plough, Odysseus swerves to avoid him, proving his sanity. Tricked, he grits his teeth and joins the fleet. Achilles, meanwhile, is hiding on the island of Scyros, dressed as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Odysseus exposes him to by laying out gifts, fine cloth, jewelry, and weapons. When Achilles instinctively grabs the sword, the disguise shatters. He's destined for Troy, no matter how hard his mother Thetis tries to shield him. Historians still argue whether these recruitment tales were ancient fan fiction, layered onto the main myth. Were they invented just to explain why such famous heroes got dragged into the story? Or did they reflect real anxieties about draft dodging and clever excuses in wartime? So, the kings arrive, Nestor from Pylos with his silver tongue, Ajax the Greater towering like a human fortress, Diomedes sharp-eyed and ambitious, and countless others. You can almost hear the roll call echo across time. Each man boards his ship, each or dips into the sea, and the fleet grows like a dark swarm dot as you sink deeper into drowsiness. Imagine the coastline receding behind them, wives waving from the cliffs, children clinging to skirts. The horizon stretches ahead, endless and uncertain, carrying not just warriors but the weight of an oath, the spark of a feud, and the first stirrings of a war that promises to last forever. The fleet is gathered, the sails are ready, but here's the problem: nature refuses to cooperate. At the port of Aulis, where the ships are meant to launch, the winds suddenly die. Imagine hundreds of ships bobbing uselessly or dragging in stagnant water, while impatient soldiers grumble on shore. The air is heavy, hot, and stale. Days stretch into weeks, the fleet stuck like a massive parking lot without an exit ramp. You can smell the spoiled food stores, hear the constant buzzing of flies, and sense tempers snapping with each passing sunrise. The priests are summoned. Someone mutters that Artemis, goddess of the hunt, is offended. Why? That depends on which version you prefer. Some say Agamemnon boasted he was the better hunter after bagging a stag, which is basically like insulting Gordon Ramsay's cooking on live television. Others claim Artemis was angry about a past slight or simply wanted to test the Greek leaders. Historians still argue whether this reflects older cult traditions, where Artemis demanded sacrifices before major journeys. The priests deliver the grim news: the goddess demands a sacrifice, and not just of an animal. She wants Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. Picture the silence that follows, broken only by the snapping of sails in the dead wind. Men look away, shuffling their feet. It's the ultimate test of leadership. Will Agamemnon sacrifice his own child for the war? Here's your quirky tidbit. Later poets softened the blow by claiming Artemis snatched Iphigenia away, at the last moment replacing her with a deer on the altar. She supposedly whisked the girl off to Taurus, where she became a priestess. But in the darker versions, the knife falls and the price is paid. Either way, Agamemnon's name is forever stained, and his wife Clytemnestra never forgives him. The winds return. The fleet stirs like a giant waking. Oars lap the water, sails below, and the Greeks finally surge toward Troy. But beneath the clamour, there's an unease that won't fade. They've already paid in blood before even setting foot on enemy soil. The sacrifice sets a tone that lingers. This war is cursed, every victory bought with loss. Historians debate whether the tale reflects real rituals of first fruits offerings before dangerous voyages. Some argue it's purely myth, an ancient explanation for why the war seemed so doomed from the start. But either way, the image of a father at the altar hangs in the background, whispering that the gods are not allies, they are fickle supervisors who demand receipts. As you let your eyelids droop, imagine those sails finally catching wind, the sound of hundreds of ships creaking forward, carrying men toward a fate already soured by divine bargaining. The horizon swallows them, and the war begins in earnest. The fleet finally arrives on Trojan shores, black ships grinding against pebbled beaches. Picture the sand whipped with spray, the thundering boots of warriors splashing through the shallows, and banners snapping in the sea wind. This should have been the triumphant opening strike. The Greeks, united by oath and prophecy, ready to make short work of Troy. But like so much in this saga, their first landing is less victory, more embarrassing pratfall. Homer only gives you fragments, but other storytellers fill in the scene. The Greeks storm the coast but miscalculate their attack. They land not at Troy proper, but on a nearby stretch of coast, facing defenders who are more than ready. The Trojans, or in some tellings, their allies, push the invaders back into the surf. Warriors fall with shields clattering into the tide, helmets rolling like tossed shells. You can almost feel the sting of salt in their wounds, the drag of water making their armor twice as heavy. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Many ancient sieges began this way. Archaeological evidence shows that the Bronze Age coastlines of Anatolia were dotted with fortified towns, and invaders often had to fight through smaller outposts before reaching the main prize. So the story of the Greeks bungling their first strike has a ring of military realism. And the quirky tidbit? One version says Protesilaus, a Thessalian king, leapt off his ship first, fulfilling a prophecy that the first Greek to touch Trojan soil would die. Sure enough, he struck down almost instantly, becoming both a heroic pioneer and a cautionary tale about not rushing ahead. Later, the Greeks built him a shrine, and sailors passing the site supposedly poured libations in his honor. Imagine being remembered forever as the guy who literally face-planted into destiny. Historians still argue whether these opening defeats were later embellishments, meant to explain why the siege dragged on for so long. After all, if the Greeks were unstoppable from day one, how do you justify 10 years of stalemate? Better to say they stumbled early, cursed by fate and sloppy tactics. The Trojans, of course, celebrate this shaky beginning. Word spreads within Troy's towering walls that the Greeks are not invincible. Morale swells, and defenders settle into the grim patience of a long war. Meanwhile, the Greeks lick their wounds on the beach, realizing that their quick strike has turned into a drawn-out grind. The salt air tastes bitter now, the fires at night flicker against weary faces. As you slip deeper into drowsiness, picture that first clash, a swirl of sea foam, bronze, and chaos. The sound of men shouting, waves breaking, and the war beginning not with glory, but with a humiliating reminder. Nothing about this will be easy, and the gods are already laughing. The Greeks finally claw their way ashore and set up camp, but Troy does not fall. Its walls rise like a defiant mountain, pale stone gleaming under the sun, almost mocking the besiegers below. You picture the Greek tents stretching along the beach, a messy sprawl of leather and canvas, smoke rising from countless campfires, and beyond them, always looming, the city of Troy, unbroken, untouchable. Those walls are more than stone. In myth, they were said to have been built by gods themselves. Poseidon and Apollo, punished once by Zeus, supposedly labored under King Laomedon to raise the fortifications. That divine craftsmanship made them more than just masonry. They were destiny carved into architecture. Historians still argue whether there's any basis to this tale, since archaeological digs at Thessalic show multiple layers of fortified cities. But even in reality, Troy's defenses were impressive enough to spark legends. The Greeks try direct assaults, but the walls hold. Ladders are pushed back, siege engines splinter, arrows rain down. The Trojans fight fiercely from above, hurling stones, boiling water, anything to repel the attackers. Every attempt ends with the Greeks stumbling back to their camp, nursing wounds and frustration. The stalemate sets in and boredom becomes as deadly as spears. Here's your quirky tidbit. While the Greeks sulked outside Troy, they didn't just sit idle. They raided the countryside, plundering smaller towns and enslaving unlucky villagers. One of these raids brought them the maiden Chryses, whose capture later sparks the quarrel between Agamemnon and Apollo's priest. So, even in their failures, the Greeks manage to generate side quests. The siege drags on. Fires flicker along the beach night after night, while music, arguments, and occasional drunken brawls break the monotony. You can almost hear the low rumble of waves against the shore, the hiss of arrows fired half-heartedly in the dark. The Trojans, safe behind their walls, watch from towers, their city life continuing, children playing in courtyards, markets buzzing, feasts echoing with lyre music. From inside, the war is inconvenience. From outside, it's despair. Historians debate whether the Trojan War myth reflects a real protracted conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian city-states, perhaps over control of trade routes through the Dardanelles. 10 years of stalemate may be poetic exaggeration, but the notion of a drawn-out, frustrating war resonates with how such struggles really unfolded for the Greeks on the beach. Though, it's not geopolitics, it's humiliation. They came for swift victory and treasure, and instead they found themselves stuck in the world's longest camping trip. Sleep settles over the camp with the sound of restless snores, men dreaming of home, while across the plain the walls of Troy stand silent. Patient and eternal, weeks bleed into months, months into years, and the beachside camp of the Greeks begins to look more like a permanent colony than a temporary war camp. Smoke rises from cook fires, smithies clang day and night as armor's repaired, and new trenches and huts sprout like unwanted weeds. But all that domestic routine doesn't soften the tempers of kings. Pride smolders hotter than the campfires, and eventually it erupts. The quarrel comes between Agamemnon and Achilles, the two men least capable of sharing a stage. Agamemnon, commander of the expedition, is the kind of leader who demands respect but rarely earns it. He's haughty, blunt and quick to remind everyone that his fleet is the largest. Achilles, on the other hand, is younger, deadlier, and used to being treated like the superstar warrior he is. Put them together and sparks fly. It all starts with Chryses, a Trojan woman taken as a war prize by Agamemnon. Her father, a priest of Apollo, begs for her return. When Agamemnon arrogantly refuses, Apollo sends plague arrows into the Greek camp. Soldiers drop sick, animals die, and the air fills with the stench of decay. The seers declare the obvious: Chryses must be returned. Furious at the humiliation, Agamemnon surrenders her but vows to take another prize to prove his dominance. That prize is Achilles' companion, Briseis. Imagine the scene: Agamemnon's heralds walking into Achilles' hut, awkwardly seizing the woman, while Achilles clenches his fists, torn between slaughtering them and swallowing the insult. In the end, he storms to the shore, stands at the breaking waves, and screams for his mother Thetis. A sea goddess? Through salty tears and foamy surf, he begs her to intervene. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Quarrels over spoils were a real problem in ancient warbands. Archaeologists studying Mycenaean society note that loot wasn't just wealth, it was honor. Proof of bravery. Losing a prize was like losing your resume. The quirky tidbit: some later plays had Achilles sulking so melodramatically that he refused to cut his hair or trim his nails until his honor was restored. Think of it as the Bronze Age version of "I'm not leaving my room until you apologize." Historians still argue whether the quarrel is poetic exaggeration or a metaphor for deeper rifts among Greek leaders. Either way, the effect is seismic. Achilles withdraws from battle entirely, refusing to fight, which is like Michael Jordan sitting out the finals because of locker room drama. Without him, the Greeks falter and the Trojans surge with renewed confidence. Night settles on the camp with the sound of strained silence. Warriors mutter by the fires, knowing they've lost their deadliest blade. Across the plain, the Trojans sharpen spears and whisper about Achilles' absence. Pride has done what Troy's walls could not. It has broken the Greek army from within. With Achilles brooding in his tent, the Trojans suddenly sense the tide shifting. Imagine Hector, usually calm and dutiful, now striding along the walls of Troy like a man finally free from the shadow of invincibility. He rallies the citizens, shouts encouragement to his troops, and even proposes pushing the Greeks back to their ships. It's a gamble, but with Achilles sulking, the gamble looks promising. The battles roar louder. Greeks stumble without their champion, while Trojans drive forward with fresh fury. Spears splinter, shields clang, and the dust on the plain rises so thick it smothers the sun. Each day, the Trojans inch closer to the Greek palisades, pressing their advantage like a team finally realizing the star quarterback has left the field. Meanwhile, Achilles sits by the sea. You can almost hear the waves mocking him, greatest warrior alive. Yet here you are pouting on the beach. He spends his days strumming a lyre, humming melancholy tunes and glaring at anyone who dares interrupt his sulk. For the ordinary soldier slogging through battle, it's maddening, like knowing you've got a nuke in storage but refusing to use it because someone bruised your ego. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Greek warfare in the late Bronze Age really was fragile in its leadership structures. The king Wainax wasn't a dictator. Power was spread across competing nobles. One personal feud could disrupt the entire military machine. And a quirky tidbit for you ancient Greek audiences actually loved sulky Achilles. In some vase paintings, he's shown lounging in his tent with his lyre, a picture of moody, almost teenage rebellion. Apparently, even back then, people related to the guy who refuses to participate until he's treated with respect. Historians still argue whether this episode reflects an actual shift in battlefield tactics. Some suggest that the absence of Achilles mirrors times when key allies truly withdrew support from a campaign, forcing generals to scramble. Others insist it's pure poetic drama designed to show how one man's pride can endanger thousands. On the battlefield, the Greeks suffer. Ships smolder, wounded groan, and the morale crumbles. The Trojans, emboldened, even camp outside the city walls overnight. Something unthinkable when Achilles was fighting. The war, which once felt like a stalemate, suddenly tips toward Troy. Night after night. You imagine the Greek fires burning low, warriors whispering nervously about home. Some dream of escape. Others curse Agamemnon for his arrogance. All know one thing. Until Achilles returns, the Greeks are doomed to bleed on the sand. And Achilles? He just sits, silent and unmovable, a storm waiting to break. While Achilles pouts by the shore, the gods can't resist meddling. Imagine Olympus like a celestial soap opera, deities peering down with popcorn in hand. Zeus, reluctant to pick sides but secretly entertained, watches as his favorites clash. Hera and Athena fume at the Greeks' delays, seething over Paris' earlier insult, while Aphrodite flits around protecting her mortal darling, Helen. The battlefield below becomes less about men and more about divine chess pieces, moving pawns, and knights that will dot the Trojans get subtle boosts. Apollo rains arrows upon Greek soldiers, killing and panicking without ever lifting a mortal weapon. Athena counters, whispering tactics into Diomedes' ear, helping him strike key targets. Poseidon stirs the waves against ships, but occasionally calms them when he favors a hero's glory. You can almost hear the gods laughing or sighing over every human misstep. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Greeks often attributed unusual battlefield successes or failures to divine intervention. Victories and defeats were seen as the will of the gods rather than purely human strategy. That's why Homer and other epic poets integrated gods so thoroughly they mirrored a worldview where the divine was always in play. Quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe gods disguising themselves as warriors. Apollo could appear as a Trojan soldier, shouting commands. Athena might nudge an arrow just slightly off course. The soldiers believed they were fighting men, but really, a god had a hand in every near miss. Think of it as the ultimate cheat code. Historians still argue whether these divine interventions reflect real religious rituals, prayers, and sacrifices meant to influence battle, or whether they're purely storytelling devices. Either way, the effect is clear. No human plan can succeed without considering the whims of higher powers. Meanwhile, the Greeks grow frustrated. Tired, starving, and wounded, they curse the gods under their breath, grumble about Agamemnon, and look toward Achilles' empty tent with longing and dread. The Trojans, on the other hand, feel invincible, emboldened by the supernatural forces at their side. For the listener drifting off, imagine the chaotic battlefield as a blur of bronze, sand, and divine lightning. Every arrow, every scream, and every shield bash carries the invisible fingerprints of the gods. The war stretches on, not just because of mortal stubbornness, but because the Olympians are playing their own long game and humans are merely the pieces. The war grinds on, and the first true tragedy strikes. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, is drawn into battle. You can almost feel the weight of his armor, the chill of early dawn, and the nervous tension in the Greek camp. Patroclus is no Achilles, but he's brave, loyal, and eager to protect the soldiers who look up to him. When he dons Achilles' armor, he becomes a terrifying figure to the Trojans, a phantom hero inspiring both fear and awe. The plan seems simple. Let Patroclus lead the Myrmidons to push the Trojans back, without engaging Troy itself. But of course, simplicity is a fragile illusion. The moment Patroclus steps onto the battlefield, the gods lean in. Apollo nudges him toward recklessness, Hector sees an opportunity. And suddenly Patroclus is not just a stand-in, he's in over his head. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ancient armies often relied heavily on prominent leaders to inspire troops. Losing one key figure could shift morale and determine the battle's outcome. Patroclus' role mirrors this pattern, though myth amplifies it dramatically. And a quirky tidbit: some later poets insist Patroclus ghost haunts the battlefield after death, riding a spectral chariot and whispering warnings to soldiers. The ancient Greeks loved the idea of lingering spirits affecting mortal affairs, turning the battlefield into a haunted stage. Historians still argue whether Homer intended Patroclus' death as mere narrative setup, or as a reflection of real wartime grief and hero worship. Either way, his loss sets the stage for Achilles' return, transforming personal grief into national consequence. When Hector strikes, Patroclus falls, the armor clattering like a bell of doom. You can almost hear the silence of the Greeks as the news spreads, the waves of despair crashing louder than any spear. Achilles, learning of his companion's death, is consumed with rage, grief, and a desire for vengeance so intense it makes the battlefield tremble. Imagine, as you drift toward sleep, the mix of bronze blood and tears, the personal loss intertwining with the broader war. Patroclus' fate reminds you that even in epic tales, small acts of bravery carry enormous consequences, and the absence of one hero can tip the scales toward catastrophe. Achilles, now seething with grief, finally rouses from his sulk. Picture him pacing along the shore, waves lapping at his sandals, the sun glinting off his bronze armor as if mocking his delay. His rage isn't just personal, it's an elemental force, one that will reshape the battlefield for everyone involved. You can almost hear the surf mingling with the war cries yet to come, a prelude to a storm of vengeance that no mortal can withstand. He consults with his mother, Thetis, who weaves sorrow and prophecy into counsel. She reminds him of his fate: either die young in glory at Troy or survive to live a long, obscure life at home. The decision is almost redundant. Achilles' anger and grief make him reckless, and glory is irresistible. You can imagine him donning the full Myrmidon armor, each piece a reminder of Patroclus, each swing of the sword a personal declaration. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the concept of Kleos, or eternal glory, was central to Mycenaean and Homeric warrior culture. Achilles embodies this ideal. His deeds ensure his memory endures, sometimes at the cost of everything else. Quirky tidbit: some versions of the myth say Thetis commissions new armor forged by Hephaestus, the god of fire and metal, which gleams so brightly it blinds enemies on the battlefield. Imagine trying to fight a man who looks like a walking disco ball of doom. Morale would plummet instantly. Historians still argue whether Achilles Return narrative was meant to highlight individual heroism or serve as a cautionary tale about unchecked anger. Either way, the effect is undeniable. His presence alone tips the scales. As Achilles charges into battle, Trojans falter, their formations breaking beneath the sheer force of his wrath. He slays countless warriors, his movements almost choreographed by grief and fury. The sand is churned with mud, blood, and the echoes of dying cries. For the Greeks, his return is salvation. For Troy, it is sheer terror. You, half asleep, can picture the storm unleashed, a single man reshaping the fates of hundreds. The clash of bronze and sinew, the whizzing of arrows mingling with the roar of waves. In Homer's epic, wrath isn't just personal emotion. It's a weapon, and Achilles wields it with devastating precision. The war, already long, is momentarily reshaped by grief and rage alone. Hector, Troy's noble champion, stands at the heart of the city, fully aware that Achilles' return changes everything. You can almost see him pacing the ramparts, sun glinting off his helmet, the weight of responsibility pressing like a stone on his chest. He's not just fighting for victory, he's fighting to protect his family, his city, and the honor of generations. The irony? Hector has long been considered the embodiment of duty, yet the fates have lined him up for disaster. The battlefield becomes a personal stage. Hector meets Achilles face to face, and you can feel the tension crackling like lightning over the plains. Their duel is inevitable, monumental, almost operatic. Bronze clashes, dust swirls, shields splinter, and the cries of soldiers echo across the plain. Hector fights valiantly, but Achilles' wrath is merciless, precise, fueled by grief and divine intervention. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Homeric duels often served as focal points in battles, where the clash of leaders could determine morale, even if not the full outcome. Killing a prominent warrior could dramatically shift the strategic landscape. A quirky tidbit: some stories describe Achilles chasing Hector 3 times around the walls of Troy, before finally striking him down. You can almost see it as a cosmic game of tag, with the fate of a city hanging in the balance. Historians still argue whether Homer intended Hector's death to glorify Achilles, humanize Hector, or simply explain the continuing siege. Either way, Hector's fall is seismic. He dies bravely, nobly, and far too early, yet the war does not end. Troy remains stubborn, its walls unbroken, the city not yet conquered. The Trojans mourn their prince. Priam, Hector's father, laments while clutching at the walls, and the city trembles with grief. Funeral rites are hastily arranged as soldiers weep, remembering that even the bravest cannot defy fate forever. Meanwhile, Achilles continues to rage, his vengeance momentarily sated, but his fury ensuring the war grinds onward. As you drift further into sleep, imagine Hector's helmet glinting in the dying light, his body respectfully carried back behind the walls, and the ominous knowledge that his death, though dramatic, changes nothing in the larger scheme. The war stretches on inexorable, a reminder that even the mightiest heroes cannot end a conflict by themselves. After Hector falls, the Greeks revel in a momentary surge of triumph, yet the war refuses to bow. Picture the Myrmidon soldiers dragging Hector's body across the plains, the sand dark with sweat and blood, while the Trojans inside the walls mourn and whisper curses. Even in death, Hector's presence lingers, reminding everyone that Troy will not yield easily. Achilles, temporarily sated by vengeance, begins to show a subtle shift. Grief softens into reflection, though only slightly. He remembers Patroclus, the cause of his fury, and the fleeting nature of life even for the great. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Funerary rites in Bronze Age Greece were of enormous social and religious importance. Honoring the dead properly was seen as essential for both the soul and the living community, and neglecting these rituals could anger the gods. A quirky tidbit: some later poets describe Achilles weeping in the tent for 3 consecutive days, refusing food, leaning on his sword, and moaning so mournfully that even his enemies sympathize. Think of it as the world's first dramatic method acting performance, over the top, unignorable, and entirely memorable. Historians still argue whether the prolonged mourning episodes in the epics are rooted in real customs or are poetic exaggerations designed to emphasize the human cost of war? Either way, Achilles' temporary pause in battle highlights the tension between personal emotion and collective conflict. Meanwhile, the war grinds on at the city gates. The Trojans are reorganizing, rallying survivors, and preparing for counterattacks. Paris, though infamous for sparking the conflict, retreats into the background, leaving the heavy lifting to Hector's brothers and the city's defenders. The Greeks press forward cautiously, wary now of the walls, the terrain, and the persistent, stubborn spirit of Troy. Imagine the horizon, black ships along the shore, smoke curling from countless fires, the constant echo of distant battle cries. The war, fueled by divine meddling, human pride, and unyielding fate, drags on. Even in moments of victory, there is no finality. Each hero's death, each strategy, each skirmish simply extends the stalemate, as you feel the sand between imagined toes and the salt in the air. Remember this, the Trojan War is not a story of quick wins or decisive battles. It is a drawn-out symphony of stubbornness, grief, pride, and divine interference, a conflict that lasts forever because no one, mortal or god, is willing to yield. The Greeks, despite their victories, are beginning to fray at the edges. Months of stalemate, repeated skirmishes, and endless marching along the coast weigh heavily on morale. Imagine soldiers sitting around fires, licking wounds, gnawing on hardened bread, while the smell of salt, smoke, and fear lingers in the air. Complaints ripple through the ranks. When do we eat? When do we sleep? And why is Achilles still sulking? The last question is repeated often enough to become a chorus of frustration. Agamemnon, ever the impatient leader, grows irritable. His decisions, once firm, now teeter under the stress of endless stalemate. Advisors argue constantly. Spies report Trojan movements that may or may not be accurate. The entire Greek command feels like a ship caught in dead water, sails taut but windless, waiting for a gust that might never come. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Prolonged sieges in the ancient world were brutal, often causing famine, disease, and psychological strain even before the enemy walls were breached. It's easy to see why a war lasting 10 years or even decades in legend would wear down both sides. Quirky tidbit? Some later storytellers claimed the Greeks became so bored at Aulis and along the Trojan coast that they invented board games, storytelling competitions, and even mock battles to pass the time. Imagine a war so drawn out that someone invents the ancient equivalent of cards against humanity to survive the tedium. Historians still argue whether the endless fighting reflects real historical campaigns or whether the epic exaggerates the duration to emphasize the futility and tragedy of war. Either way, the psychological toll is undeniable. Meanwhile, the Trojans take advantage of Greek fatigue. Skirmishes are more daring, patrols more aggressive, and their walls feel impregnable once again. Paris occasionally attempts raids, though he remains less heroic than his brother Hector. The Trojans' confidence grows as they sense cracks in Greek unity. Cracks driven not just by battlefield setbacks, but by petty quarrels, exhaustion, and human frailty. As night falls, picture the campfires flickering along the beach, the rhythmic lap of waves, and soldiers staring into the distance with weariness etched on their faces. The war stretches like a horizon that never ends, a slow, grinding reminder that even the mightiest heroes and armies cannot accelerate destiny. Amid this wearying stalemate, the gods continue their meddling with all the subtlety of toddlers on a sugar high. Zeus watches from Olympus, sometimes weighing victories and defeats like a cosmic accountant, while Hera and Athena whisper advice or threats into the ears of generals. Aphrodite flits around Helen, offering comfort and chaos in equal measure. You can almost imagine the sky flickering as if winking, each flash a reminder that mortals are mere playthings in a divine chess game. The battlefield itself seems to respond to divine whims. Winds shift inexplicably, sending ships veering off course. Arrows veer mid-flight. Sudden storms drench soldiers before they reach dry ground. Historians still argue whether these interventions were mythic metaphors for real environmental challenges or simply a storytelling device to maintain tension. Either way, the effect is palpable. Meanwhile, Greek commanders grow increasingly desperate. Agamemnon orders probes along the walls, while lesser leaders Diomedes, Nestor, and others test Trojan defenses, seeking weaknesses. The Trojans, alert and emboldened by Achilles' temporary absence, anticipate these moves. You can hear the clash of bronze and the pounding of shields as skirmishes flare across the plain, like sparks from a forge. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Bronze Age city sieges often involved repeated probing attacks. Before committing to full-scale assaults, victory relied as much on psychological pressure and attrition as on brute force. In this way, Homer's endless battles mirror real-world military strategy amplified by myth. A quirky tidbit? Some sources claim that during these skirmishes, Trojan horses or early prototypes of wooden siege devices were tested in minor forms, long before the famous ruse. Imagine soldiers pushing oversized wooden structures along muddy fields, occasionally getting trapped or tipping over. Much to the amusement of observers, you can also see the subtle human toll, boredom, fear, and frustration weigh on soldiers. Supplies dwindle, tempers flare, and minor disputes can escalate into duels. Every day, the horizon seems endless, the walls of Troy unyielding, and the war stretches both body and mind thin dot as you drift into sleep. Picture the plain alive with tension, armies poised for action, gods invisible yet palpable, and the slow, inevitable grind of a war that refuses to end. Even brief victories are fleeting, and every clash only reminds both sides that this conflict has become something larger than mortal. Ambition a story measured in years, not days. The tide of battle begins to shift subtly, not because of strength or strategy, but because of cunning. Odysseus, always the clever schemer, starts whispering plans into Agamemnon's ear, suggesting ways to exploit Trojan overconfidence. You can picture him pacing along the shore at dusk, gesturing animatedly while soldiers and minor leaders look on, half impressed, half exhausted by his endless scheming. His mind works like a labyrinth, turning every minor weakness into a potential advantage. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Intelligence and deception were critical in Bronze Age warfare. Scouts, spies, and clever strategists often determined outcomes more than raw force alone. Odysseus' reputation for cunning reflects this very real aspect of military life. A quirky tidbit? Some later poets claim Odysseus once disguised himself as a beggar to spy on Trojan patrols, wandering among enemy lines unnoticed while sketching out their formations. Imagine a Mycenaean James Bond, barefoot in mud and ridicule, taking notes on his enemies. Historians still argue whether these clever exploits are based on actual reconnaissance techniques, or are purely narrative embellishments to show the hero's intelligence. Either way, Odysseus' contributions keep the Greeks from total collapse during Achilles' absence. Meanwhile, the Trojans, sensing Achilles' presence still looms but is not yet unleashed, probe Greek positions cautiously. Skirmishes flare and die like sparks, keeping both sides tense. You can almost hear the whispered counsel of Hector as he reassures his men, balancing confidence with caution. Knowing the moment of ultimate confrontation is still distant, the Greeks, encouraged by Odysseus' plans, test small victories capturing supply caches, disrupting patrols and occasionally forcing Trojan units back. Each tiny success is a morale boost, a momentary reprieve from the grind of the siege. Yet, in the back of every mind, the knowledge of Achilles' wrath, Patroclus' death, and the unyielding walls of Troy remains ever present. Imagine the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the plain, the waves whispering in rhythm with tense heartbeats, and both armies settling for the night with uneasy dreams. Even small successes cannot erase the reality. This war, filled with cunning, courage, and divine meddling, is far from over and will not end anytime soon. The siege drags on, and small annoyances start to grow into full-blown crises. Supplies run low, tempers flare, and boredom becomes a weapon almost as effective as spears. Imagine Greek soldiers arguing over who gets the last dried fish, or debating which campfire roast tastes the least burnt while the smell of salt, smoke, and sweat hangs thick in the air. It's a war of attrition, both physical and mental, and every day feels like a week. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Prolonged campaigns in antiquity, often saw morale deteriorate rapidly, leading to desertions, mutinies, or internal disputes. Armies were fragile in more ways than one. Human psychology could be as decisive as strategy. A quirky tidbit? Some sources claim that Greek soldiers invented their own entertainment, to cope singing mock ballads about each other, racing on the beach, or staging amateur wrestling contests between exhausted warriors. Picture a soldier with bronze helmet, bare feet in sand, grappling with a friend just to pass the time. Ancient military boredom was apparently universal. Meanwhile, the Trojans use every advantage they can. They repair walls, reinforce towers, and train younger fighters while observing the Greek camp. Word spreads that some Greek leaders are bickering over loot or rations, and the defenders' confidence swells. Historians still argue whether such detailed portrayals reflect real military psychology, or are narrative devices meant to stretch tension in the epic. Either way, it works. Greek unity is fraying under pressure. Achilles' absence continues to loom like a storm cloud. Every Greek skirmish feels half-hearted, and even victories carry a hollow aftertaste. Patroclus' death is never far from the soldiers' minds, fueling both sorrow and anger. While the Trojans' morale climbs steadily with each day, the great warrior remains ashore. Imagine the camp at night, smoke curling from countless fires, the rhythmic slap of the waves, groans of the wounded, and whispered conversations of strategy or complaint. Tents flap, armor clinks, and dreams are restless. The war stretches like an endless horizon, with no resolution in sight, each side trapped in a cycle of skirmishes, fights, and divine intervention. Even now, you can sense the futility, the weariness, and the inevitability. The Trojan War will last forever, not just because of walls or weapons, but because human stubbornness and divine interference refuse to allow an easy end. By now, the Greek camp feels like a small city, complete with routine, hierarchy, and petty disputes. Imagine rows of tents stretching along the shoreline, smoke curling lazily into the air, while soldiers go about menial tasks, sharpening weapons, repairing armor, or arguing overwatch duty. Even minor grievances explode into shouting matches, because after years of stalemate, everyone is on edge. The monotony of waiting wears on the mind more than the battles themselves. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Long sieges in the ancient world often resulted in social tension, as rank-and-file soldiers and commanders clashed over supplies, recognition, and spoils. Morale management was just as critical as military strategy. A quirky tidbit? Some accounts suggest soldiers invented camp rituals to ward off boredom, competitive storytelling, exaggerated boasting contests, and mock duels with sticks while wearing helmets. Picture exhausted men staging theatrical fights just to feel alive, while their captains roll their eyes and shake their heads. Meanwhile, the Trojans remain vigilant. Scouts report Greek weaknesses and leaders quarrel too openly. Others are overconfident, and Achilles still hasn't returned. Each piece of information is a chance to exploit, and Hector, ever the strategist, pushes his troops to probe the Greek lines carefully, testing defenses without overcommitting. Historians still argue whether these small skirmishes reflect actual Bronze Age siege tactics, or are narrative devices meant to stretch tension in the story. Supply lines become a constant concern. Grain, wine, and salted meat must be ferried from Greece to the beach, and every delay exacerbates irritation among troops. Disease spreads quietly through crowded tents, adding an invisible enemy to the list. The once proud Greek army begins to feel like a weary workforce rather than a fearsome force. Imagine the sun setting over the Aegean, the campfires flickering against darkening sands, warriors murmuring complaints and prayers, and the distant glimmer of Troy's walls reminding them of why they endure. Even with victories and skirmishes, the war remains unbroken. Each day another test of endurance. Cunning and divine patience dot in this long, drawn-out waiting game. You sense something crucial. The Trojan War is as much about psychology, strategy, and stubbornness as it is about swords and shields. Its length is inevitable, and every weary dawn stretches the conflict a little further into eternity. As the Greek siege continues, the Trojans grow bolder. Imagine young warriors, previously hesitant, now venturing beyond the walls to skirmish with Greek patrols. The sand churns beneath their feet as they test the enemy, sending back tales of victories or near misses to boost morale inside Troy. The city hums with cautious optimism, festivals of small triumphs playing out even amidst the looming war. Meanwhile, Greek frustration simmers. Officers argue over tactics, while soldiers grumble over rations, guard duty, and the incessant sound stuck in every fold of armor. You can almost hear Nestor's patient voice trying to reason with overexcited young men, offering advice that's half wisdom, half plea for sanity. Even Agamemnon's command feels strained. The weight of leadership presses down, every minor failure magnified by the long delay. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Morale and leadership were critical in ancient armies, particularly during protracted campaigns. A single quarrel among commanders could compromise an entire army, while effective leadership could maintain cohesion even under terrible conditions. A quirky tidbit: some accounts claim Greek soldiers began using war mascots, small statues, painted shields, or carved wooden figures to mock the Trojans or inspire courage. Imagine a line of soldiers facing death, nervously gripping a tiny carved owl or lion like it carries the fate of the battle. Historians still argue whether these details are accurate reflections of Bronze Age soldier behavior or later embellishments meant to humanize the epic. Either way, it underscores the sheer psychological toll of a siege that refuses to end. Odysseus continues to plan, scouting weaknesses and suggesting cunning strategies. But even his intelligence cannot solve the root problem. The war has become a grind, a prolonged contest of endurance, pride, and patience. The Trojans' walls hold firm, and every Greek victory feels temporary, like footprints in wet sand washed away by tides as you drift towards sleep. Picture the night settling over the camp, fires flickering, soldiers muttering complaints and prayers, waves whispering against the shore. The siege stretches on, the war lengthened by stubborn men, patient walls, and meddling gods. Even small skirmishes carry weight, because in a battle of endurance, every choice ripples across the endless expanse of time and sand. In the midst of this endless siege, a glimmer of hope or mischief, depending on perspective, emerges in the form of divine strategy. Athena, ever the schemer, approaches Odysseus with suggestions that toe the line between cunning and outright trickery. Picture them meeting in shadow tents, whispers carried over the roar of waves, while lesser soldiers look on, clueless and slightly suspicious of the secrecy. Their goal? To find a way to finally break the stalemate, however small the gain. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Espionage, subterfuge, and psychological tactics were integral to Bronze Age warfare. Messengers, disguises, and feints often determined outcomes as much as direct combat. Odysseus embodies this practical cunning, magnified into near-mythic genius and Homeric narrative. A quirky tidbit: some poets later describe Odysseus sending Trojan spies misleading gift cakes, shaped like miniature warriors or statues painted as sleeping guards. Whether these were literal or metaphorical, the idea adds a touch of absurdity to the otherwise deadly serious siege. Imagine enemy soldiers staring at a tiny cake and wondering if it's a trap. Historians still argue whether these clever exploits reflect real reconnaissance techniques or are narrative exaggerations, designed to highlight Odysseus' intelligence. Either way, the effect is clear: morale, perception, and information become weapons as critical as swords. Meanwhile, the Trojans continue their vigilant patrols, bolstered by Hector's leadership and their growing confidence in the Greek army's exhaustion. Minor skirmishes flare, with soldiers clashing at the edges of the plain, only to be swept back toward their respective camps. The war becomes as much about patience, observation, and timing as about brute strength. Back at the Greek camp, tensions rise. Agamemnon frets over supplies and loyalties, while younger warriors grow restless, bored with the slow pace. Every night, soldiers peer into the darkness, imagining Trojan ambushes, ghostly figures, or divine tricks. Even victories are tinged with anxiety, because in a war of attrition, triumph is temporary, and defeat can strike unexpectedly. Picture, as you let your mind drift, the flickering campfires, the restless soldiers, the distant glimmer of Troy's walls, and the invisible tug-of-war waged by gods and men alike. The siege is no longer just a battle. It's a slow, patient dance of endurance, pride, and divine meddling. Each day stretches into the next, a reminder that the Trojan War is a conflict designed to last forever. The war reaches a peculiar rhythm. Day after day, the Greeks and Trojans engage in skirmishes, probing attacks and minor victories, none of which end the siege. Imagine the Greek camp alive with repetitive motion, soldiers sharpening weapons, repairing shields, tending fires and murmuring complaints about heat, sand, or lack of wine. Even the sand seems endless, stretching between the two armies like a slow, eternal countdown. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Prolonged campaigns often required constant logistical management. Feeding thousands, repairing armor, and maintaining morale were as critical as winning battles. Ancient leaders understood that a war could be lost as much by supply shortages as by enemy swords. Quirky tidbit? Some later stories claim Greek soldiers staged mock tournaments on the beach. During lulls in fighting, inventing impromptu games with shields, sticks, and even fish. The absurdity of soldiers wrestling in bronze armor while trying not to fall into sand. Or surf adds a humorous, human touch to the relentless campaign. Meanwhile, the Trojans adapt. Hector, ever diligent, rotates soldiers, reinforces walls, and maintains patrols while encouraging civilians. Even the city's markets continue under careful supervision, creating a sense that life persists despite the shadow of war. You can almost hear the murmur of daily trade, and the laughter of children mingling with the clang of distant spears. Historians still argue whether these details reflect Bronze Age realities, soldiers finding ways to occupy themselves, or narrative embellishment, meant to stretch tension. Either way, they emphasize that prolonged conflict is as much psychological as physical. The Greek leaders attempt new strategies. Odysseus proposes fights. Diomedes tests Trojan defenses. Nestor offers guidance to keep soldiers disciplined. Yet every success is fleeting. Trojans, fatigued but vigilant, respond with caution and determination, keeping the siege from tipping decisively in Greek favor. Imagine the night. Campfires flicker, waves lap against the shore, shadows twist across the sand, and the endless horizon seems unbroken. Each day blends into the next, a slow-motion war where even heroes grow weary, and the gods' interference ensures that no single triumph can last. The Trojan War, it seems, is engineered to endure, a tension-filled saga where patience, endurance, and stubbornness govern more than swords or spears. The stalemate stretches into yet another season. You can almost feel the heat of the sun, the grit of sand between weary toes, and the tang of sea spray mixed with smoke. Soldiers shuffle through routines that have become ritualized, repairing tents, mending armor, rationing food, and whispering prayers or curses depending on the latest skirmish. Even the loudest warriors have grown quiet in the weight of monotony. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Prolonged military campaigns required careful rotation of soldiers, rationing, and makeshift sanitation to prevent disease. Many ancient armies suffered as much from these logistical challenges as from enemy attacks. Quirky tidbit? Some sources claim that Greek soldiers began keeping war diaries, crudely etching daily events on wooden tablets or fragments of pottery. These logs included minor victories, sarcastic notes about commanders, and even sketches of enemy soldiers doing silly things. It's the ancient equivalent of a TikTok diary, minus the camera. Meanwhile, the Trojans continue to thrive behind their walls. Hector oversees training exercises for young men, ensures the city's gates are reinforced, and orchestrates supply rotations to avoid shortages. Paris occasionally conducts minor raids, though mostly for personal glory rather than strategic impact. Citizens adapt to the siege, blending fear and resilience in their daily lives. Historians still argue whether these details reflect authentic city life during sieges, or are literary embellishments meant to highlight the endurance of Troy. Back at the Greek camp, tensions rise. Agamemnon frets over logistics, soldiers gripe about watch rotations, and whispers of Achilles' eventual return circulate like a rumor-laden tide. Even minor skirmishes spark disproportionate reactions, small wins celebrated like victories, minor defeats mourned like tragedies. The war becomes a psychological test as much as a physical one. Imagine the nightfall, shadows stretching across the endless beach, campfires flickering in the breeze, waves lapping quietly while distant shouts echo from the walls. The Trojans sleep with vigilance, the Greeks with unease. In this slow, drawn-out rhythm, every day passes in tension, endurance, and careful calculation, reminding you why the Trojan War feels infinite. The combination of human stubbornness, divine meddling, and protracted conflict ensures that the story cannot end easily. The Greek camp has settled into a rhythm of exhaustion and petty competition. You can imagine soldiers lining up at dawn, arguing over firewood or water, while the smell of salt, sweat, and burned meat fills the air. Even the officers are strained, their tempers fraying as skirmishes, long watches, and supply shortages take their toll. The monotony is oppressive, broken only by the occasional clash with the Trojans or the distant sound of waves crashing against ships. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ancient armies on prolonged campaigns often suffered from low morale, not just from combat losses, but from fatigue, hunger, and boredom. Leadership required more than tactical skill. It demanded psychological resilience to keep men cohesive. A quirky tidbit: some accounts claim that Greek soldiers began creating mob battles to entertain themselves. During idle periods, wrestling with sticks, racing across the sand, and staging dramatic reenactments of legendary duels. Imagine exhausted warriors in bronze armor, slipping in the sand while trying to imitate Achilles' strikes. It's both ridiculous and oddly human. Meanwhile, the Trojans use every advantage. Hector rotates soldiers, reinforces gates, and encourages citizens to continue daily life, creating a sense of normalcy within the siege. Even children and artisans have roles, whether helping transport supplies or tending animals. Historians still argue whether these portrayals reflect real city resilience, or are epic narrative devices to emphasize Troy's stubborn endurance. The Greek leaders are not idle either. Odysseus continues to probe weaknesses in the Trojan defenses, suggesting feints and minor raids to test reactions. Diomedes sharpens strategies, Nestor counsels patience, and Agamemnon tries to maintain authority despite growing irritation and the constant shadow of Achilles' eventual return. Picture the scene at twilight, flickering campfires, the rhythmic slap of waves, soldiers murmuring complaints and prayers, and the distant glow of Troy's walls. Even victories are tinged with caution, as both sides know that the war stretches beyond any single skirmish. The Trojan War endures because human stubbornness, divine interference, and relentless siege tactics make resolution nearly impossible. As time stretches on, even minor events gain disproportionate importance. A single skirmish, a misfired arrow, or a delayed supply shipment can ripple through the Greek camp like a storm. You can almost see soldiers pacing the shore, sharpening swords with frustration, complaining about sand in their armor, and muttering about how long this war will drag on. Every day is a test of patience, endurance, and nerve. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Long-lasting sieges in antiquity often relied on small, tactical engagements, reconnaissance, and attrition rather than full-scale battles. These micro-conflicts were psychologically taxing, often more than pitched battles themselves. Quirky tidbit: some later tales suggest soldiers began betting on the outcomes of minor skirmishes, or which officer would have the worst day. Imagine exhausted warriors gambling with dice carved from bone, trying to find excitement in a war that drags endlessly. Meanwhile, the Trojans adapt like seasoned athletes. Hector continues to train new recruits, supervise wall repairs, and coordinate counter-skirmishes. Even Paris, usually preoccupied with personal glory, joins in minor raids, testing Greek vigilance and morale. Historians still argue whether Homer's portrayal of the Trojans' resilience reflects authentic siege behavior or poetic license emphasizing narrative tension. Back at the Greek camp, Odysseus concocts more subtle plans, feints, distractions, and intelligence-gathering missions meant to tip the balance without risking lives unnecessarily. Diomedes executes scouting operations, Nestor encourages patience, reminding weary soldiers that endurance is its own strategy. Agamemnon frets, yet even he begins to see merit in calculated subtlety over brute force. Imagine the scene as dusk falls, campfires flicker against darkening sands. Waves lap rhythmically and shadows stretch long across armor and tents. The Greek army, fatigued and anxious, mirrors the broader sense of waiting. The war's length has become a character in itself. Both sides persist not merely because of strategy, but because human stubbornness and divine interference create a cycle of endless tension, ensuring that no day is final, no victory absolute, and no siege concluded. As months turn to years, the soldiers on both sides grow eerily accustomed to the war's rhythm. Picture Greek warriors waking to the sun, polishing armor that's already scuffed, rationing stale bread, and listening for distant shouts that signal yet another minor skirmish. The sand has become ingrained in every fold of clothing and hair, and the scent of salt, smoke, and sweat is as constant as the waves themselves. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In prolonged campaigns, soldiers often adapted to the hardships of siege life, developing routines, rituals, and coping mechanisms to maintain discipline and survival. Endurance became as important as skill in battle. A quirky tidbit: some poets later describe Greek soldiers marking days of the siege with improvised calendars, tallying minor victories, failed raids, and who had the worst watch rotation. Imagine warriors counting days not by moons or months, but by skirmishes and spilled wine. It's absurd, yet deeply human. Meanwhile, Hector continues to organize the Trojans efficiently. Walls are reinforced, young recruits trained, and citizens' duties carefully rotated. Even as casualties mount, Troy demonstrates resilience, markets remain open, workshops continue, and morale is subtly maintained. Historians still debate whether Homer intended these details as realistic reflections of urban life under siege or as narrative tools to stretch tension. Back at the Greek camp, frustration simmers beneath the surface. Agamemnon grows impatient, commanders argue, and ordinary soldiers dream of home. Yet Odysseus' cunning plans, Diomedes' scouting, and Nestor's counsel keep operations moving, preventing complete collapse. Even the smallest successes, capturing supplies or disrupting a patrol, are celebrated disproportionately, a psychological boost against the endless monotony. Picture twilight settling over the shore, fires flicker, the wind carries whispers and prayers, and waves lap rhythmically against hulls and sand. The battlefield feels suspended in time, a liminal space where heroism, exhaustion, and divine whimsy intertwine. The Trojan War endures not through constant slaughter alone, but through the cumulative weight of human stubbornness, fatigue, and the meddling of gods who delight in watching mortals struggle. The war evolves into a slow dance of attrition. Soldiers on both sides have grown intimately familiar with the relentless rhythm, dawns punctuated by shouted orders, afternoons spent in exhausting skirmishes or drills, and nights that offer little rest amid the crackle of fires and the hum of restless troops. You can almost feel the sand clinging to their skin, the brine of the sea in the air, and the weight of endless anticipation pressing on every shoulder. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ancient armies engaged in extended sieges often relied on endurance, rotation, and supply management rather than continuous large-scale assaults. Psychological stamina was crucial. Armies could collapse from monotony and fatigue as easily as from defeat. A quirky tidbit: some sources claim Greek soldiers invented elaborate bets to pass time, predicting which Trojan soldier would drop his spear first, who would get stuck in the mud, or which officer would complain most loudly about the sun or sand. It's a strange, almost absurd coping mechanism, yet it kept the weary mind engaged. Meanwhile, the Trojans remain vigilant and resourceful. Hector inspects walls, rotates units, and encourages civilians to participate in defense or logistical tasks. Paris occasionally joins in minor skirmishes, attempting to prove himself, while the city hums with a mix of tension, daily routine, and subtle optimism. Historians still debate whether Homer's depiction reflects actual Bronze Age urban resilience, or is a narrative device designed to highlight the prolonged nature of the war. Back at the Greek camp, leaders grow restless. Agamemnon frets over supplies, Odysseus concocts new schemes, and Nestor attempts to keep morale intact. Even minor skirmishes are treated as victories or disasters, depending on perspective. Every day extends the siege, every clash reinforces the futility of haste, and the spectre of Achilles' rage looms, ensuring the war remains a drawn-out ordeal. Picture twilight, shadows lengthen over tents and armor. Campfires flicker, waves lap rhythmically, and the soldiers' murmurs blend with distant wall clanging. The Trojan War has become more than combat. It is endurance, strategy, and stubborn human will combined with divine interference. Each day stretches endlessly, teaching both sides that time itself is an adversary as relentless as any soldier dot by now. The war has become a test of patience, cunning, and sheer stubbornness. You can imagine Greek soldiers trudging through sand, patching armor, and sharpening weapons, while the Trojans maintained their disciplined rotations behind fortified walls. Every minor skirmish, every patrol, and every misstep reverberates like a pebble in a pond, affecting morale and strategy alike. The battlefield is no longer just a place of conflict. It is a stage for endurance, wit, and human stubbornness. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Extended sieges often relied on attrition, psychological tactics, and careful resource management. The ability to maintain discipline and morale over months or years was as crucial as martial skill. In determining outcomes, a quirky tidbit: some later stories describe Greek soldiers assigning nicknames to the Trojan gates, walls, and towers, joking that one was too stubborn, another too tall, as if anthropomorphizing the city to make the endless siege feel more manageable. You can picture tired men laughing over bronze armor and sand-smeared faces while staring at the walls that refused to fall. Historians still argue whether Homer intended the drawn-out nature of the siege as a reflection of historical realities, or as a literary device to explore human endurance, divine meddling, and heroic behavior. Either way, the prolonged war emphasizes that even mighty heroes are constrained by circumstance, time, and stubborn opponents. Odysseus continues to craft plans, testing Trojan defenses with minor raids and feints, while Diomedes and Nestor balance aggression with caution. Agamemnon attempts to maintain authority, though whispers of discontent ripple through the ranks. Each day's minor victories or losses blend into a rhythm of anticipation, frustration, and strategic patience. Imagine the sun setting over the endless sands, casting long shadows across campfires and armor. Soldiers murmur prayers and complaints, waves lap rhythmically, and the distant walls of Troy seem impossibly resilient. The war continues not through constant action alone, but through human endurance, strategic cunning, and divine interference. In this slow, endless grind, both sides are locked in a test of wills that could last forever. And every action, no matter how small, echoes across the sands and the minds of warriors, gods, and listeners alike. The turning point begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the tide inching forward. You can picture the Greek soldiers noticing small changes, new formations tested at dawn, supply lines reinforced, and Odysseus whispering hints of something bigger in shadowed tents. There is tension in the air, a sense that patience and cunning are about to converge in a moment of subtle yet decisive action. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Military strategy in prolonged conflicts often relied on careful observation and incremental adjustments rather than immediate, dramatic assaults. Commanders who noticed patterns and vulnerabilities had an advantage, sometimes turning months of stalemate into opportunities for decisive maneuvers. A quirky tidbit: some later sources suggest Greek soldiers began decorating minor siege engines with personal charms, or doodles to bring luck, creating a humorous contrast with the seriousness of their task. Imagine men in bronze armor giggling over a stick figure on a catapult, even as they prepare for real danger. Meanwhile, Hector remains vigilant. He rotates soldiers, inspects walls, and anticipates minor Greek raids, keeping Troy's defenses tight. The city seems resilient, but subtle cracks begin to show as fatigue and constant observation take their toll. Historians still argue whether these micro-level details are accurate reflections of siege warfare, or narrative embellishments to maintain tension. Agamemnon grows uneasy, worried about both logistics and morale, while Odysseus and Diomedes fine-tune their plans. Every small skirmish, feint, or reconnaissance mission now carries heightened significance, for even minor shifts in positioning or morale could influence the balance of a protracted conflict. Imagine the camp at dusk, campfires flickering, the rhythmic slap of waves against hulls, murmurs of soldiers blending with the distant clanging from Troy's walls. Even as the war grinds on, small adjustments, quiet observations, and calculated risks are beginning to sow the seeds of potential change. Yet, the siege is far from over. The wheels of fate turn slowly, ensuring that the war's conclusion will demand patience, cunning, and relentless endurance from both mortals and gods alike. A subtle shift emerges as the Greeks focus on psychological tactics rather than brute force. Imagine Odysseus quietly coordinating feints, staging minor victories to lure Trojan attention, and encouraging soldiers to exaggerate their presence along certain stretches of the beach. The Trojans, ever vigilant, respond cautiously, unsure if each skirmish is genuine or a clever ruse. The tension is palpable, like walking a tightrope over waves that never break. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ancient armies often used deception and diversion as central strategies in sieges. Demonstrations of force, false retreats, and feigned attacks could erode enemy morale and create openings for decisive moves. A quirky tidbit? Later sources describe Greek soldiers painting tiny faces on captured enemy shields and placing them conspicuously, hoping the Trojans would interpret them as spies or omens. It's an early example of psychological warfare with a whimsical twist. Imagine hardened warriors giggling while manipulating symbols on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Hector monitors the city closely, balancing the need for vigilance with troop fatigue. Patrols are rotated, walls reinforced, and civilians involved in support roles. Even minor lapses in attention could invite Greek advantage, so his focus is constant. Historians still debate whether Homer's detailed depiction of siege management reflects authentic Bronze Age practices or narrative embellishment to emphasize the war's enduring tension. Agamemnon frets over supplies. Commanders clash over strategies, and soldiers stretch every ounce of patience. Yet, Odysseus' subtle tactics begin to produce incremental gains. Small victories captured supplies, forced retreats. Disrupted patrols demonstrate the power of cunning and preparation. Even if the overall siege remains unresolved, picture nightfall, campfires flicker, shadows stretch across sand and armor, waves lap rhythmically, and soldiers whisper prayers and complaints alike. The war's psychological dimension is becoming as crucial as the physical. Every decision, every minor skirmish echoes across the sands and the minds of those engaged. The Trojan War, you realize, is less a battle of immediate triumphs than a marathon of strategy, endurance, and stubborn will. Orchestrated by both mortals and gods' daughters, the Greeks refine their strategies. The siege acquires a rhythm of anticipation and cautious opportunity. Soldiers trudge along the beach, shields clinking and sand crunching underfoot, while commanders whisper plans beneath tents swaying in the evening breeze. Each small skirmish or feint is now measured, deliberate, and calculated, designed to probe Trojan weaknesses without committing to full engagement. The tension is constant, like a low hum vibrating through the camp. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Effective reconnaissance and incremental tactical adjustments were vital in Bronze Age sieges. Commanders who observed patterns, exploited minor lapses, and adapted their strategies gained critical advantages, without the need for costly full-scale assaults. A quirky tidbit? Some tales humorously recount Greek soldiers leaving small gifts, or mock threat letters at Trojan wars to provoke or confuse, blending absurdity with cunning. Imagine hardened warriors smirking as they leave carved figurines or playful warnings, a bizarre mix of theater and psychological manipulation. Meanwhile, Hector remains a meticulous overseer. He monitors war rotations, troop readiness, and civilian contributions, aware that even minor lapses could be exploited. Paris attempts occasional raids, seeking personal glory, but Hector tempers ambition with strategic caution, ensuring that Troy remains resilient despite weariness and mounting casualties. Historians still debate whether Homer intended such details as realistic siege behavior, or as narrative devices to stretch tension and highlight human and divine endurance. Back in the Greek camp, morale fluctuates. Agamemnon frets, young soldiers grumble, and minor disputes flare over food, watch duties, and perceived slights. Yet Odysseus' clever maneuvers begin to yield small successes, intercepted supplies. Distracted Trojan units, minor retreats each a psychological boost, demonstrating that subtlety can rival brute force in prolonged conflicts. Picture dusk, flickering campfires casting shadows over tired faces, rhythmic waves brushing hulls and sand, murmured prayers blending with whispered complaints. The war continues, not as a series of decisive battles, but as a drawn-out test of endurance, cunning, and persistence. Each day becomes a rehearsal for eventual confrontation, every small advantage carefully nurtured, reminding you that the Trojan War endures because human stubbornness, strategy, and divine interference make resolution elusive. By now, the Greeks have mastered a delicate balance of patience and cunning. You can see soldiers moving with quiet precision along the beach, shields polished despite scuffs, and tents meticulously arranged to maintain order amidst chaos. Every small skirmish is calculated, every patrol deliberate, and every minor victory celebrated as if it were decisive. The camp exudes a strange rhythm, exhaustion tempered by strategic focus. Here's a mainstream historical fact: in protracted sieges, incremental gains, careful planning, and attention to morale often determine success more than heroic charges or singular battles. Commanders understood that small, consistent advantages could accumulate into significant strategic leverage. A quirky tidbit: some accounts describe Greek soldiers placing symbolic markers along the beach to confuse or intimidate the Trojans' tiny statues, painted stones, or mock banners. It's an almost whimsical layer of psychological warfare, with weary men crafting mischief out of boredom and strategy alike. Meanwhile, Hector maintains vigilance over Troy, orchestrating rotations, supervising wall repairs, and ensuring that citizens continue their contributions to the city's endurance. Even Paris joins minor raids, though Hector tempers ambition to prevent reckless losses. Historians still argue whether Homer's depictions reflect actual siege logistics, or are narrative devices emphasizing persistence and resilience. Back at the Greek camp, Agamemnon frets, commanders argue, and soldiers grumble over food and watch rotations. Yet Odysseus' subtle maneuvers, small feints, reconnaissance, and psychological tricks begin to tilt the balance in small but meaningful ways. Diomedes and Nestor support these efforts, reinforcing the slow but deliberate strategy of attrition. Imagine twilight settling over the shore. Shadows stretch across armor, fires flicker against darkened tents, and murmurs of soldiers blend with the rhythmic sound of waves. Each day of the siege is an exercise in endurance, cunning, and human stubbornness. Even small advantages are magnified by the relentless patience required to maintain them. The Trojan War, you realize, is a long, slow test of will, amplified by the gods' meddling and the human capacity for persistence, ensuring that the conflict drags inexorably forward. Day after day, the war finally reaches its final crescendo, though not in the way you might expect. Picture the Greek camp alive with tension, soldiers poised, shields polished, armor clinking softly as they move with rehearsed precision. Small skirmishes have escalated into more deliberate maneuvers, feints and distractions choreographed to perfection, or under the watchful eye of Odysseus and the weary yet determined commanders. Every step, every arrow loosed, every whispered order matters more than ever before. Here's a mainstream historical fact: decisive maneuvers in ancient sieges often relied on careful coordination, patience, and exploiting enemy fatigue rather than sheer numbers or brute strength. Commanders who observed, calculated, and timed their actions effectively could achieve results far beyond what raw force promised. A quirky tidbit: some sources suggest that Greek soldiers decorated the inside of siege engines with personal symbols, or tiny carvings of gods, heroes, or comical figures to bring luck. You can picture exhausted men giggling quietly at these little charms, even as they prepare for potentially deadly operations. Meanwhile, Hector continues to balance vigilance with human limits, rotations of defenders, wall inspections, and the careful integration of new recruits maintain the city's defense. Paris still pursues personal glory with minor raids, though Hector ensures that ambition does not override strategy. Historians still argue whether Homer intended these details to mirror historical siege practices or to illustrate the tension between human skill and divine oversight. As the Greeks execute their final coordinated moves, subtle feints, distractions, and carefully timed assaults, the Trojans respond with caution, discipline, and unwavering focus. Even small successes on either side carry heavy psychological weight as morale, exhaustion, and divine oversight intersect on the battlefield. Picture the scene. Twilight deepens. Fires flicker, the rhythmic slap of waves persists, and soldiers whisper prayers, complaints, and cautious encouragement. The culmination is not a singular moment, but the coalescence of years of strategy, endurance, cunning, and human stubbornness. The Trojan War, you realize, is a test of patience as much as prowess. Where gods and men alike are entwined in an epic of nearly infinite duration, the siege finally eases into a quiet rhythm, though not because the fighting has ended. Rather, the endless motion of strategy, caution, and fatigue has softened into a lull. You can feel the warm night air on your skin, hear the gentle slap of waves against the hulls, and smell the mingling scents of salt, smoke, and tired sweat. Soldiers huddle by campfires, murmuring low conversations, repairing shields, and whispering prayers to gods who have been present in both mischief and guidance throughout the long years of conflict. The Trojans, too, pause, not from surrender but from exhaustion and careful rotation. Guards shift, walls are inspected quietly, and young recruits peer nervously at the dim glow of Greek fires. Life continues within the city, stubborn and resilient, a testament to human endurance even under siege. The rhythm of daily survival, cooking, repairing, patrolling blends seamlessly with the pulse of the ocean, the whisper of wind, and the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Even the legendary heroes feel the softness of this moment. Odysseus lounges, plotting his next subtle maneuver with patience. Hector observes quietly, aware of both strengths and limits. Agamemnon reflects on leadership and endurance, knowing that patience is a weapon as vital as any sword. Each warrior, each civilian, each observer exists suspended in the slow, endless weave of time, caught between anticipation and reflection. Courage and fatigue. You, lying in your own bed, can almost feel the weight of centuries, the persistence of human stubbornness, and the interplay of divine whimsy. The Trojan War is less a story of quick triumphs than a slow meditation on strategy, endurance, and patience. And as the fires burn low and the waves whisper their endless song, you drift into a softer, dream-filled state, reassured by the knowledge that even in chaos, life continues, battles pause, and the world, in its subtle rhythms, endures.